Hi everyone, I'm Gertie and welcome to our final month in the Society of Charm theme on Patreon. It's been such an amazing year with you all and we have a really exciting pattern to wrap up the year with called the Starlet Gown. This is a sleek and very sexy knit dress that is perfect for end of the year holiday parties, but it's also very much inspired by something that you all have been requesting for quite a while, which is something inspired by a 30s bias cut gown. So this is very golden age of Hollywood, very Jean Harlow, has a cowl neck for a very glamorous draped look. There is a low back option, which is super sexy, but optional because we have also included an optional modesty panel for the back, which can be made in lace or in fabric. There are two skirt lengths, the full length gown and then a knee length, cocktail length version. But this is also fully interchangeable with our society dress, which was the first pattern this year. So I really wanted a pattern that was going to bookend the year on this theme. So you can use the two sleeves from the society dress in the Starlet Gown. You can also interchange the two skirts from the society dress, which means you can make so many different dresses with these two patterns. And I know how much you all love the society dress, so I hope that the Starlet Gown really rounds out your wardrobe of knit dresses. All right, so we're going to get started with the pattern pieces and then we will move on to fabric and supplies and then sewing. Okay, so now we're going to look at all of the pattern pieces together laid out on the table. As usual, we have minimized the pieces down to 25%, which is especially handy in a gown like this with these long floor length pieces so that we can see them all on one surface together and get a sense of how the pattern comes together before we start sewing. So let's look at the bodice pieces first. They're a little unusual looking. This is the bodice front, which is cut one fabric on fold and one lining on fold. So let's talk a little bit about this piece and why it looks the way that it does. So it has more fullness at the top here because it's a cowl neck to create those drapes. And it also has a self-facing, which is a triangular shape. And you can see there's a line at the top of the facing right here, and that's a stitching line. So what's going to happen is you're going to insert a weight into that little pocket right there. We used quarters here in the studio because that was something we had handy. You can also use washers or something like that. But weights are very common in cowl necks because they help the facing stay inside the dress and to weight down the drape of the cowl so it lays really beautifully. Okay, so that's why it's shaped the way that it is. There are no darts for shaping on this. It's in a knit, so it will fit really beautifully even without the dart shaping. Then you have your bodice back. I'm going to cut two fabric and two lining for the bodice back. Now you can't really tell from this piece, but if you make it without the inset, there is a beautiful V back opening that goes all the way to the waist on this dress. And there are marks for where you could tack chains across the back like we did on one of our samples, which is really beautiful and also helps the shoulders stay put in this cowl neck with the open back. So that's one thing that you can do. If you're not into an open back style, you can use this back inset piece, which gets inserted here and creates a sort of modesty panel on the back. You can cut that in your dress fabric if you like, but you can also do it in a contrast, and you'll see in some of our samples we used lace, either with a scalloped edge or not, and you can also use a lining or not. So you have some options here for how risque or how modest you want your dress to be in the back. Now, the skirt back, let's talk about this first because it's a little unusual. It has a back yoke that comes to a point at the back. And this was inspired by 30s gowns, of course. And it's a really beautiful look. And it just means that you're going to need to sew the skirt back pieces. You have a skirt back, cut one fabric on fold, sew it at this princess seam to the skirt side back, which is cut to fabric. And then you're going to sew the skirt back yoke to those pieces, being really careful to get a nice, beautiful point at center back. And we'll talk about that in the sewing, of course. And then for your skirt front, this is a fairly simple princess seam skirt in the front. You're going to cut your skirt front 1 fabric on fold, skirt side front 2 fabric. And you can see the shaping of these pieces has a bit of a tulip or trumpet shape to it by flaring out at the notches here. If you would like to do the knee length version, just be mindful of these cutting lines here. You're going to cut there rather than the floor length version. Okay, so that's it for such a glamorous gown, really only a few pattern pieces. So next we're going to talk about the fabric and supplies for your starlet gown. Okay, let's talk fabric and supplies for the starlet gown. So this is similar to the society dress. The recommended fabrics are the same. So maybe you have some leftover fabric you can use, but you're looking for light to medium weight knit fabrics that have 50 to 70% stretch. So that means if you take about 4 inches of the fabric in your hands, it should stretch to 6 or almost 7 inches. So somewhere in that range. Okay, so you are looking at stretch velvets are a great possibility, just like with the society dress in these beautiful jewel tones. So you're looking for that amount of stretch in one direction. In the vertical direction, little to no stretch, okay? We also experimented with using matte jersey for the starlet gown, for the knee-length cocktail versions, and it looked really beautiful. So if you're looking for something more wearable day to day, try matte jersey. This one is made from rayon and I believe spandex, and it comes in a lot of beautiful colors, but black, of course, is a wonderful everyday basic. And then lurex, which you know is one of our favorites here in the Charm Studio. This is spandex poly jersey mixed with metallic fibers. It's really beautiful and it's going to make a very lovely, glamorous starlet gown. Then if you want to do that back inset in lace, you will of course need lace. You can do one with a scalloped edge like we did on our black sample and looks really gorgeous. You can choose to leave it unlined for a hint of skin in the back, or you can line your back inset as well. If you would like to line it but still have a scallop, keep in mind that is possible. You're just going to have to change the directions a little bit so that you hem the top edge of your lining and put it behind the scallops, okay? So you can either do the lace on its own or you can layer it over your dress fabric, totally up to you. Finally, you will need lining. This bodice is lined to the edges for a nice clean finish. And we use this knit lining with stretch in it. You will want your lining to have the same amount of stretch as your outer fabric, of course. And if you're really having trouble finding the right knit lining, you can always use your fashion fabric as your lining as well, if it's something that's comfortable against the skin. Okay, so that's it for recommended fabrics. Let's talk about the other supplies that you need for the starlet gown. You'll need some sort of weight to weigh down your cowl. We used a quarter. We found it was the perfect weight to hold it down and make the drape really beautiful. You could also use a washer if you have something like that around the house. If you're doing the backless option, you'll want something to hold the back together, to hold it nice and taut so that the shoulders don't fall off. So you could go really fabulous and flamboyant like this rhinestone fringe that I have in the studio here. We didn't make any samples with this, but I really think we should because it would look amazing on the starlet gown. We did a sample where we used 2 different kinds of beaded chain and then doubled it up across each point. And that looked really beautiful too. You can really customize this however you want. If you're just going to use one type of chain and do it across the 3 points, then you'll need about 1 yard, but it really depends on what you want to do and how many strands you want to use. So keep that in mind. Now, if you're not feeling the flamboyant options, you could use a ribbon across the back too. If you wanted to do a velvet ribbon to match your gown, that would look very sleek and minimalistic. And then finally, you will need machine needles, either stretch or jersey needles to match the weight of your fabric. And then last but not least, of course, you will need thread to match your fabric. And we always recommend all-purpose polyester thread for sewing your garments. So that is it for your fabric and supplies. And now we are ready to move on to our sewing. Okay, so Andrea is going to be sewing the sleeveless version with the inset in the back for us today. So thank you, Andrea. And the first thing that we are doing is we are sewing the shoulder seams. So grab your bodice front and there's a circle mark at each shoulder seam and you're going to clip into that to the circle. And make sure not to clip past 5/8 of an inch, but just to the circle. And then you are going to take each bodice back and align the pieces right sides together. There's a circle on the bodice back that you can match to the circle on the bodice front at the shoulder seam. And make sure that circle is right on top of itself. And then you're going to continue to pin the rest of the shoulder seam to the outer shoulder edge. And make sure that the outer shoulder edge is aligned at the 5/8 of an inch seam line as well. And then place a few more pins in between. And then we're going to stitch this from the circle mark to the outer shoulder edge. So you can use a narrow zigzag for a stretch knit like this. Or if you use a straight stitch, just give it a little stretch as you're stitching. And you're going to back stitch starting at the circle and then back stitch at the end as well. And now we're going to press these seam allowances open. And just be careful with something like velvet, like we're using, you don't actually want to press the fabric directly. Just kind of hover your iron over it and give it some steam because you don't want to crush the nap or make marks on the right side of the velvet. So there's your shoulder seam. You're going to repeat that on the other side and then repeat it on your lining pieces as well. So a total of 4 shoulder seams. And then we will move on to the next step. Now what we're going to do is line the back inset piece. So on this version, we have one back inset that is cut out in the velvet, and we have used the velvet to underline, and then there's a layer of black lace on top of it. Those two are basted together and now treated as one layer. And then we have our inset lining, which is in this black lining material. So you're going to put the two right sides together and pin them along the upper edge. Now, keep in mind that the inset is optional, so you may be skipping this step. And it's also optional to line it. Let's say you're doing a lace and you want it to be sheer or use the scalloped edge at the top, you wouldn't be lining it. But we are lining it, so we're stitching at 5/8 of an inch along that upper edge that we just pinned. And then you're going to grade those seam allowances. So the lining should be the narrower seam allowance as you trim it, and then the outer inset, the dress fabric, will be the wider one. And then you're going to flip it so that it's right sides out and understitch. So we are understitching using a straight stitch and just giving a little stretch and understitching on the lining side. And then you're just going to press it from the lining side, just rolling in the seam line to the wrong side. And now we're going to pin it along the open edges, so those two long angled edges. Pin with the wrong sides together, and then we're going to baste these edges together so that it's all one piece and lays flat. So using a long machine stitch, 4 to 5 millimeters, we are basting together at 1/2 inch. On both those pinned edges. And then this will be your inset piece ready to sew to the dress. Okay, so now we're going to attach the back inset to one side of the bodice back. It doesn't matter which side, but you can only attach one, and then we're going to do the lining process. So leave one side unattached. Okay, so there is a circle mark on your back bodice on the center back. There are actually a couple circle marks. There is one that's higher up towards the shoulder seam, and that one indicates where you would attach the chain or the ribbon if you're going to do that detail to, especially for the backless version, to keep it from falling off your shoulders. And then there's a lower circle that is where the inset matches up to the bodice. So that's the one you're looking for. And you're going to match that circle to the upper finished edge of the inset. And pin right sides together from the circle down to the waistline. And now we're going to stitch this, so use your narrow zigzag and backstitch on both ends. And there's your back inset attached to your back bodice. Okay, so now we're going to sew our neckline, which is actually from your back waistline all the way around the cowl neck and to the opposite back waistline, excuse me. So this is a really big seam. It's hard to show all of it on camera, but we're going to talk you through it. So you're going to start pinning on one side, the lining to the bodice, right sides together at that shoulder point where you clipped. So place a pin there. And also important to note that if you're using velvet like we are, you're going to want to stitch directionally. You always want to stitch in the direction of the nap, not against it, because otherwise you will get puckers. So what you're going to see Andrea doing is flipping this halfway so she can stitch directionally with the nap and then break her stitching and flip it over and stitch the other way with the nap. So that's something that you'll want to keep in mind if you're sewing with stretch velvet. Okay, so the part we're pinning right now is actually the front bodice. It's that point that we talked about in the pattern piece chapter with where we're going to insert the weight into. So we're pinning from the shoulder seam to that point at center front, which is where the weight is going to get inserted. So whether you're using a washer or a quarter, you can see we have faintly a line there that we're going to stitch across that little pocket for the weight. So we're pinning to center front from the shoulder seam. And now we're going to pin from the shoulder seam to center back, and you can see the inset attached there. So what's going to happen is the inset is getting sandwiched between the lining and the bodice. And we are matching at the waistline circle, waistline mark, and pinning. And then you'll want to make sure that the circle where the top of the inset meets matches from the lining to the outer bodice and pin there, and then fill in pins in between. And we're going to do something a little different on the other side because we need to leave it open where the inset gets sewn. So keep that in mind. But on this side, we're just going to pin from the shoulder down to the back waistline. And there you can see the inset sandwiched in between. And now we're going to repeat this process on the other side. So you can see Andrea is flipping it over and pinning from the other side so that she'll be able to stitch directionally with the nap. So again, we're going to start at that shoulder point where the clip is. Okay, so you're going to want to put 2 pins in a cross mark at the circle for the inset, for the top of the inset. And that will be an indication to stop stitching there. So just put 2 pins in an X like that, because we're going to need to leave it open from that circle down to the waist so that we can sew the inset in a separate step. Okay, and then just fill in pins from the shoulder point down to your X. And keep in mind that if you are not doing the inset, so you're doing the backless version, you would just sew both sides all the way down. You don't need to leave anything open. Very easy, just sew all the way down. Okay, so now we are stitching as pinned. And because of that directional stitching, we are starting at one side at the center front cowl point and going to the waistline. So there's that shoulder seam that those seam allowances need to stay pressed open. Okay, and on this side, because we're doing the inset, we're gonna stop stitching at our crossed pins and back stitch there and leave open below the circle. And now we're going to break our stitching, flip the whole thing over, go back to the center front cowl point, and do the other side all the way down to the waistline edge. Now, if you're not using a velvet or a fabric with a nap, then you can just sew the whole thing in one go and pivot at center front. But we're just doing this because of our nap situation with the velvet, so keep that in mind. The other thing, of course, is that if you don't have the inset, again, you don't need to leave it open below the circle, okay? You can stitch all the way down to the waistline. But we have it open from that circle mark down, and now we're gonna grade the seam allowances. So no matter which version you did, you're gonna grade the seam allowances, and you're gonna be trimming the lining so it's the narrower one, so down to about 1/4 inch. And then the dress itself, that seam allowance should be wider, so about 3/8 of an inch. So you're gonna grade all the way around this long neckline seam. And at the point where the inset is attached, you can leave the seam allowances as is. Don't trim those yet. And the next step will be to understitch, and we will do that in the next chapter. Okay, so now we're going to understitch our entire neckline, and we're starting at that circle opening where it's open below for the inset. If you don't have the inset, you can start at the back waistline, just do the whole thing. But if you do have this open area for the inset, you're going to start a little bit above it, maybe 1/4 inch, and use a straight stitch. You can stretch the fabric slightly as you're sewing if you're worried about retaining the stretch in your fabric. And making sure that your seam allowances are underneath where you're stitching, you are going to stitch just about 1/8 of an inch away from the seam line on the lining. And when you get to the cowl point, you're gonna have to break your stitching because that area is too small. That little triangular point is too small to understitch there. So break your stitching and then continue. And on this side, we'll be able to go all the way down to the waistline. And that was the side with the inset. Okay, so now you can see the whole thing is understitched, and what we're gonna do now is what we always do after understitching, which is press. So you're just gonna roll the lining in and roll the seam line out to the edge and just give it a little press. or in the case of velvet, give it a little hover with steam. And you're gonna go like that all the way around the neckline. Just rolling with your fingertips out to the edge. Okay, so pressing all the way around, and then your understitching step will be complete. There's that little inset in the back. So here you can see the completed understitched neckline. Okay, so now we're gonna stitch the weight into the cowl pocket. So you can see this is our understitched cowl point. We have the line marked in for the stitching line on the pocket. And then you're gonna wanna grab something that has some weight to it. So you can use a washer, you can use a coin. We found a quarter was the perfect weight for this. Andrea asked me for a quarter one day. I could not figure out why she needed a quarter. And then it turned out she had been experimenting and this was the perfect weight. A penny is a little too light, but a quarter is perfect. And so you're just gonna insert your weight into that little point there and then pin along the marked line. And now we're gonna stitch it in place, creating this little pocket. Okay, so you wanna make sure that the quarter or your weight is pushed away from your pin so that you don't hit it, obviously, you would break your needle. And you can use a straight stitch. Make sure that your thread matches your dress fabric here, or at least your bobbin thread, so that you don't see that stitching line on the right side of the dress, though this will be hidden on the inside too, keep that in mind. So there is your finished weight pocket in your cowl. Okay, the next thing we're gonna do is stitch the armholes. So if you've ever sewn a sleeveless garment that's finished to the edge before, you've probably done it this way, where you leave the side seams open and then you stitch the neckline first and then the underarms or the armholes. So that's what we're gonna do, and then everything gets turned out through the shoulders. So you're gonna match right sides together your armhole, it's like a C shape, the lining to the bodice, and match your notches, and we're pinning from underarm to underarm. And if you're doing sleeves in your dress, because you can use the society dress sleeves, just make sure to read the instructions for the order which you would put those in. Okay, so the armhole is pinned, and now we're going to stitch that entire C shape using that narrow zigzag and backstitching at both ends. Okay, now we're going to grade these seam allowances. So yet again, the lining is going to be the narrower seam allowance and the bodice will be slightly wider. So do that grading, and then in the next chapter, we're going to come back and do the understitching on the armhole. So we can flip it right side out, pulling the backs through the shoulder seam here. And there you go, now it's right side out, and next we'll be ready to understitch. Okay, so now we're gonna understitch, so make sure your seam allowances are underneath your lining, and you can start at one side seam and stitch about 1/8 of an inch away, and make sure you set your machine to a straight stitch here. And again, you can just stretch the fabric slightly if you're using a straight stitch at any time on a knit like this. You're only gonna be able to go so far because it does get too narrow. So you're gonna have to break your stitching, flip it around, and start again from the other side. So each armhole will have to be done in 2 stages of stitching. Okay, so then just lay it out flat with the lining on top, and then of course you're gonna press next. So just roll the lining to the inside of the dress. And press, and there you go. So just repeat that on the other armhole, and your armholes are now understitched. Okay, so now we're going to finish this back inset version. So if you don't have the back inset, you don't have to do this step. You've already finished both sides. They're clean finished. But remember, we left that opening for the back inset on one side. So now we're going to do some steps so that we get a completely clean finish for this. So you are going to take the bodice back that's open below the circle, and you're going to match it right sides together to the inset. And you're going to match at the circle mark. You have 2 circle marks, right? You have the waistline, which is really important. You want to make sure that your circles match there. And then you also have the circle at the top of the inset. So make sure that you're matching through all the layers. So we're just pinning the outer bodice to the inset right now. But next we're going to pin the lining as well. Okay, so now grab your lining and you're going to sandwich the inset between the lining and the dress. Okay, so just align those raw edges. The dress and the bodice right sides together with the inset sandwiched in between them. And doing it this way is going to give us a really nice clean finish on the inside of the dress where the entire thing is lined to the edge. And again, with the lining, make sure to match up those circle marks. So the circle marks should match through all of these layers. And now we're going to stitch this. So you're going to take it to the machine and you're going to stitch starting at the upper circle mark and then stitch down to the waistline. So remember earlier we said you don't want to understitch too close to this. That's because you want to be able to meet up the 2 lines of stitching here. So you should have a previous zigzag stitch where you stitch the seam, the neckline seam. So you should be starting right there so that your 2 lines of stitching just meet. And it can be a little awkward to get in here. You kind of have to get in between these layers in an awkward way, but it's gonna be so beautiful on the inside, it will be worth it. So you're gonna start stitching here and back stitch. And just be careful that all of your layers stay in place here. And it can get pretty thick, especially if you underlined your inset like we did. Because the inset is lined and the dress is lined, so if you have a lace layer as well, it can get quite thick here. So just make sure that everything stays where it's supposed to, and then stitch to the back waistline, the center back. Okay, now we're just going to check this before we trim anything down. Just make sure that you're happy with how that inset looks. You want those points at the waistline to meet exactly in a V. So if you're not happy with how it looks, now is the time that you can go back and fix it. But if you are, then you can turn everything so that it's wrong side out again. And now we're going to trim down these layers. Just get rid of some of that bulk. So grade your seam allowances. So the dress lining will be the narrowest one, and then they can get progressively wider from there. Okay, and then you can turn the whole thing right side out, and next we're going to finish understitching. Okay, so now we're going to understitch this. So essentially connect our line of understitching because it was understitched down to that point where the inset was inserted. And now you just want to finish off your understitching so that you connect those two lines of understitching. So you kind of have to get in between the layers here and make sure that you're stitching through the correct layers, the seam allowances to the lining, and then break your stitching, and then your understitch. Okay, so this is the final step on our bodice, which is to sew the side seams. So like anytime you would line a sleeveless garment to the edge, the side seams are the last thing you're going to do. So you're going to open them out and then match right sides together, one side seam, so down to the waist, and then in one continuous line of pinning from the waist on the dress itself, match the underarm, and then down to the waist on the lining. Just fill in with pins, and then we're going to stitch this in one continuous line of stitching from one waistline to the opposite, from the dress waistline to the lining waistline. And use your narrow zigzag here for a little stretch. And you're going to backstitch on both sides. And then you're going to press the seam open. So it can be helpful to put it on a tailor's ham or a seam roll or something like Andrea's going to do, just to raise it a little bit. And this may look shorter than your side seam. This is a sample that we made for Susie, who's very short-waisted. So we made some alterations for her. So it might look a little shorter than yours. And now you're just going to flip the lining to the inside and then repeat that process on the opposite side seam, and you will have a completed bodice. Just press in that armhole a little bit more too, around the side seam. Okay, so there's your bodice, and next we're going to move on to the skirt. Okay, so now we're going to sew the skirt back yoke. We've already completed some skirt steps up to this point. These are very long seams that are hard to show on camera, so we've gone ahead and sewn these seams. That's the front princess seams and the back princess seams. So in other words, you've sewn the center back panel on the skirt to the side back panels. And on the skirt front, you've sewn the skirt center front panel to the skirt side front panels and pressed those seam allowances open. And the skirt back has this pointed yoke, which is a beautiful 30s detail. We've done some stay stitching at that center back point at 1/2 inch. That's very important. And then you're going to clip right to that point. So right up to your stitching. And now that clip point is going to match the circle or the point on your yoke, and put a pin right at the match point. This is a tricky little area to sew, so take it slow. You may need to do it a couple times, but the most important thing is that you pin it right at that clip, right at that circle mark. And now you're going to pin the rest of the yoke seam and make sure that your notches on the yoke match the seams on the skirt. I really love this detail. Andrea and I went to see the show on Broadway called Some Like It Hot, and it is based on the movie with Marilyn Monroe, but it's sort of updated. It had these beautiful 30s gowns, and a lot of them had pointed yoke features on the gowns like this. So I was very inspired by that, which is why you see this yoke on this dress. It is a little tricky to sew, but it definitely gives it that vintage vibe. Okay, so you're all pinned, and now you're going to sew from one side of the skirt to the center back point and pivot. So when you get to the center back with a clip, you're going to pivot, push everything out of the way, and then continue on the other side. And now just check your yoke that you're happy with it, the point. And if you're not, if you got a puck or anything, it's not a big deal. You can just take those stitches out now and go back and fix it. You don't have to take the whole thing out even, just around the point. And now you're going to press this seam allowance open. And just double check, and there you have a beautiful back yoke. Okay, so now we're going to sew the side seams on this skirt. So you're going to put the skirt front right sides together with the skirt back, and you have some notches to match. So start with those and put pins there. And you're going to match the waistline and the hem points, and then just fill in stitches in between. Fill in pins in between, excuse me. And at the yoke seam, make sure that those seam allowances stay pressed open. You can just put a couple pins there to make sure that they stay flat. And you're going to fill in a lot of pins. This is a really long seam. Unless you're doing the knee length version, then it's a shorter seam. But we are going all out with gowns for these velvet versions. So we got nice long seams here, lots of pins. And again, you're going to make sure to stitch the nap directionally. If you're sewing with velvet, that is. So use your narrow zigzag and stitch all the way from one end to the other, back stitching on both sides. And now you're going to press the seam open. So you want to use maybe a sleeve board to elevate your skirt, and then at the hip curve, it's a really good idea to use a ham because it is a curved seam there. And then you're going to steam those seam allowances open. And continue to use the ham in the curved area. And then about when you get to that notch where the skirt flares out, it has a sort of trumpet shape. So when you get to that notch, then you can lose the ham and just use a flat surface because it's a nice straight seam from that notch down. You're going to repeat all these steps on the other side seam, and then we'll be ready to attach the skirt to the bodice. Okay, so now we're ready to attach the skirt to the bodice. So you are going to put the bodice wrong side out and put it right sides together with the skirt at the waistline. And you can match your side seams, notches, and pin all the way around the waistline. You want to make sure that any seam allowances stay pressed open when you pin them. And one important thing is the center back. If you did the version with the inset, you want to make sure that the inset point is exactly matching that center back circle on the back yoke, because you want it to be exactly aligned at center back. And if you didn't do the inset, then you'll have two separate back pieces and the point of them needs to align at that circle. So either way, you need to be very careful about aligning the back point with the circle on the back yoke. Okay, now we're going to stitch the waistline seam using a narrow zigzag all the way around. Okay, so just double check your waistline and make sure that everything looks good, no puckers, and you definitely want to check that center back point. So you want to make sure that the point on the bodice is aligned exactly above the point of the yoke. So those should be right on top of each other. And if you're doing the version without the inset, one thing that can be handy before you sew the waistline seam is to base those two center back points to make sure that they stay together and aligned before you do the waistline stitching. Okay, so that's your waistline seam, and next we're going to move on to finishing steps. Okay, just a few finishing steps for this dress. You will want to hem it. So first I would suggest hanging it for 24 hours and then trying it on, leveling up that hem, leaving yourself a hem allowance, and then turning it up 5/8 of an inch and top stitching at 1/2 inch. Also, some knits look good left raw, so consider that too. Possibly a velvet, you could just trim the bottom edge really neatly. Okay, so finally you are going to add any decorative chain to your back bodice, and then your dress is complete. Okay, that is it, your Starlet gown. I hope you have loved sewing along with us today. I also hope that you've loved the Society of Charm theme. It's been such an amazing year with you all here on Patreon, and I'm very excited to introduce our new theme on January 1st, which I absolutely love, and I know you're gonna love it too, so check back on the 1st to see our new theme. And I just wanna thank you all so much for being patrons, and I cannot wait to see your versions of the Starlet gown. I'll see you next time. Goodbye.